as it says in the book, another much more defendable definition of psychology is a set of ideas, and I'll say something about the word systematic, that's systematic in describing and explaining mental life, the mind, and behavior. Systematic essentially means if you say three things and two of them conflict, you notice and change one of them. Like they hang together, they make sense. The sort of thing you take for granted in any set of ideas that we now call scientific. If the person makes a claim on page 4 and page 6 of the theory paper, those claims have to go together, or they throw out the paper and don't publish it. By that analysis or meaning of the word psychology, psychology dates back at least to the time of Aristotle in what we normally call the West, and the Buddha in some branch of the East. This is not going to be a serious class on ancient Greece or on Buddhist thought, but it's not uninteresting to at least point this out because these ideas look so modern, even though they're so incredibly long ago. So there's the standard statue, which is still in quite good shape, I must say, of Aristotle. I think if that statue isn't from Aristotle's day, it's within a couple centuries after it. The reason it's worth pointing at Aristotle is he had even though he lived this ridiculously long time ago, so Aristotle, you know, one of the three greatest of the Greek philosophers, the one who was most scientific in the sense of trying to observe things in the natural world and make systematic, organized statements about that world. So what Aristotle does in doing so is to analyze human life, to see people as part of that world, to realize that people have a psyche in Greek, which is close enough to our conception of mind that's of course where we get the word psychology. And when he asks questions like, are there different parts or functions of the psyche, different parts of mind, and can we classify them in the way that we would classify bodily functions and distinguish digestion from respiration? Could we do the same thing for mental functions and distinguish one from another? And his distinctions, and these are spelled out in the book, so I'm not going to redo everything in the book here, and they aren't that critical to memorize Aristotle's distinctions, but they make perfect sense today. They're like distinctions between impulsive emotions that we also might share with the JT, the psychic dog, who impulsively eats dog food, versus more human reasoning that we might use to control our impulsive emotions. Those sort of distinctions that very much are used today are totally in the language of Aristotle. So he's asking a question that's modern. This is, as my understanding, essentially what the Greeks did. These ones you study in college, and there's a picture of a guy, and there's a statue. What they were doing was asking logically formulated, really good questions when you otherwise might have said, oh, people's behavior is controlled by that star. Suddenly, people like Aristotle are saying people's behavior might be controlled by a set of mental functions that work differently and are in conflict, but sometimes perfectly sensible, science-like questions, and, in fact, sometimes reasonable answers. Sometimes, obviously, the Aristotelian answers seem really wacky. They certainly do in physics. But in psychology, sometimes they're not that bad. Of course, the thing that makes Aristotle not a psychologist is that there are no methods. He didn't forget to run experiments. The whole concept of posing an idea that could be shown to be wrong by running an experiment was not there 2,300 years ago. That's essentially the great intellectual turn that gives us science like 500 years ago, but they just didn't have that in Greece. Yes, there's the Buddha, intentionally, of course, coming down. But of course, he didn't just come down. If you, like me, at some point, had no knowledge of Buddhism, which sounds incredibly abstract and what they're doing in a psychology course, and the character of the Buddha sounds, if you don't know anything, like an almost fictional being, there was this very real person. Like there's now an archaeological site in northern India that apparently is no question about it, the birthplace of the, exalted prince who then leaves the wealthy life and becomes the Buddha, like 2,200 years ago, that pillar. This pillar that just sits around there in northern India has been there for a long time, was put up by Ashoka, an Indian ruler, to commemorate the birthplace of the Buddha. The birth time of the Buddha is a little tricky. It was thought to be almost exactly the same century as Aristotle, and then somebody dug down under this temple and found that he was born another century or so earlier. But that's not the point. This is a very real person who developed, in many ways, what you would call a psychology. Yes, of course, Buddhism also functions as a religion, but a great deal of Buddhism is an analysis of how thinking processes cause emotional distress. We're not now going to go through that, but the idea is that people get wrapped up in a sense of self and kind of evaluate the self as an object that deserves things, and then when things don't go their way, oh, I got a B- on this exam, they experience the distressing emotion of anger, but it's only because they're thinking of the world in a certain way as there being a bounded self who deserves a lot of stuff. And the Buddha gives us what we would call a therapy. In fact, the technique, meditation, is used by psychologists today in therapy, and as we'll see in class, meditation really does stuff. We'll see brain research in which people who meditate have neurally different wiring as a function of the meditation and mentally better concentration skills. And so the therapy, in essence, had he used the word therapy, meditation is designed to give people enough insight that they experience less emotional distress. It, too, of course, is not a contemporary psychology for a couple, in retrospect, obvious reasons. Needless to say, not only did they not have experiments in Greece 2,300 years ago, they weren't really running contemporary. There was no subject pool anywhere in the Buddha's area of the world 2,500 years ago. And Buddhism makes what they call metaphysical claims that, in principle, are not open to scientific test. This actually bears on something that occurs briefly in Chapter 1. There's lots of interesting questions about people that you just can't address by running an experiment. So once the Buddha says there's reincarnation, such that the soul or mind lives on from one generation to the next, and there's a karma that you acquire that's passed on, even if it's right, there's no, we're not going to run anything in subject pool to see if karma is right. It's outside of the framework assumptions of science. It's an other thing, a spiritual claim, a philosophical claim. So certainly some claims we're never going to say anything about because they're outside of science. Also, as the textbook points out, there are a lot of ethical issues where you can do a survey to find out what people think, but you can't do an experiment to find out what the ethically right rule is. Like, you can't possibly be in an experiment this semester where the conclusion will be, oh, stealing is fine. No matter what happens, stealing is bad. We have a consensual, agreed-upon ethical rule, and nobody did a scientific study to develop that rule. It's a scientific question, where did the ethical principle come from? But you can't overturn the ethical principle by running a few psychology experiments. So some things like that and the metaphysical claims make somebody like the Buddha outside of science, but the point is, many of the ideas of psychology, the questions, are really old and the methods are new. That essentially is the gist of the textbook's coverage of people who lived thousands of years ago. Those people were asking questions that sometimes seem perfectly reasonable and contemporary now. They just didn't have, of course, scientific methods. Finally, if psychology means what it normally means in a psychology class, there's some kind of science, meaning a data-based effort to develop and refine ideas and reject ones that don't match the evidence. If there's a science and it's turned to questions of person, mind, and brain, as we're calling it, then it's like 140-ish years old, developing in Western Europe in the 1870s.